Here's the text rewritten exactly as requested. Victor Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping the polished wood of the table. The soft, ambient hum of the restaurant did nothing to stir his mind, which was still preoccupied with the latest business deal. His business partner, Robert, was speaking passionately about an upcoming merger, but Victor's attention had long since drifted. He had heard all this before, the same predictions, the same charts, the same projections. It was all just noise to him now. Nothing excited him anymore, nothing except the past. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice calling out his name. "Excuse me, sir. May I take your order?" Victor's gaze shifted upwards, and there she stood, a young waitress, her wavy brown hair framing her face delicately. But it wasn't just her hair or her features that caught his attention. It was her eyes, her deep hazel eyes. They were the exact same shade as Isabel's, his late ex-wife's eyes. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Clara Foster, the young waitress, looked down at the menu in front of Victor, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. Her voice trembled slightly as she waited for him to make his choice. But all Victor could do was stare at her, lost in the striking resemblance between her and Isabel, who had been gone for 5 years now. The way Clara tilted her head as she spoke, the way she smiled shyly, it all felt too familiar. It was like a ghost had materialized before him, one he wasn't ready to face. The memories flooded in. Isabel's laughter, her quiet grace, the way she would often look at him with those same eyes, eyes that spoke of unspoken love and hidden sorrows. It had been years since he had allowed himself to feel the weight of those memories, but now they were crashing down on him in an overwhelming wave. Victor struggled to compose himself. His heart pounded in his chest and his palms grew clammy. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had taken root. Clara, sensing his discomfort, smiled warmly, though her expression faltered slightly as she noticed the intense gaze he had fixed on her. I'll have the steak medium rare," he muttered, his voice betraying the turmoil inside. Clara nodded, still unaware of the impact her appearance had on the man sitting before her. She turned to leave, but Victor couldn't help himself. He watched her walk away, his eyes following her every step, the unsettling sense of déjà vu gnawing at him. As she disappeared into the back of the restaurant, Victor felt a sharp pang of something. Regret, fear, longing. He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. Something about Clara Foster felt like a piece of his past, and it was too much to ignore. The following day, Victor found himself returning to the restaurant. He couldn't shake the feeling that Clara wasn't just another waitress. She was something more, something tied to a chapter of his life that he had tried so hard to forget. The way she moved, the way she spoke, it was uncanny. It was as if Isabel's spirit had found a new vessel, a new form. But how was that possible? Victor tried to focus on the conversation he was having with Robert, but his mind kept drifting back to Clara. He found himself looking around the restaurant, waiting for her to appear again, hoping for some sign that his mind was playing tricks on him. When she finally emerged from the back, he couldn't help but watch her as she made her way toward a table on the opposite side of the room. Her smile, her graceful manner, there was no denying it. She looked exactly like Isabel. After a few moments of internal conflict, Victor excused himself from Robert and approached the restaurant manager, a middle-aged man named Greg. "Excuse me," Victor began, his voice low. "Could you tell me about the young waitress who took my order yesterday? The one with the brown hair and hazel eyes?" Greg looked up from his paperwork, a slight frown forming on his face. "Clara, you mean? She's new here, been with us for about a month now." Victor's heart raced. "Where is she from?" Greg's expression softened, as if he could sense the curiosity in Victor's voice. "Well, Clara is a bit of an enigma, actually. She was adopted as a baby. No family history, no records. Just one of those cases where we don't know much about her background." Victor's stomach twisted. An adopted child with no family ties? It felt too coincidental, too perfect. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made no sense, but at the same time, it made all the sense in the world. Isabel had died shortly after giving birth to their daughter, a tragedy that had shattered his life. Could it be that this girl, this Clara, was somehow connected to Isabel? The thought gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her than met the eye. Do you have any information on her birth parents? Victor asked, his voice barely a whisper. Greg shook his head. Unfortunately, no. Clara doesn't talk much about her past, but it's clear that she's never really known where she came from. It's a shame, really. Victor felt a chill run down his spine. A woman with no family history, no roots, and yet she looked exactly like the woman he had loved. There was something here, something he had to uncover. His need for answers had become urgent, and he knew he couldn't stop until he got to the truth. As he walked back to his table, Victor's mind raced. What did Clara's past have to do with Isabel? And why did he feel like he was being pulled back into a past he had long buried? It wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about finding a piece of Isabel that he had lost forever. The days following his encounter with the manager were a blur for Victor. The questions swirling in his mind were too heavy to ignore. He couldn't stop thinking about Clara, her haunting resemblance to Isabel, and the chilling revelation that she had been adopted. It felt like a riddle that he needed to solve, a puzzle that had been left incomplete for far too long. What if Clara's connection to Isabel was more than just physical? What if she carried with her some forgotten piece of Isabel's legacy? That evening, Victor found himself alone in his penthouse, the city lights flickering outside his window. He sat at his desk, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the paperwork in front of him but seeing nothing. His mind kept returning to the same thought. Clara. He had to know more about her, had to find a way to piece together the fragments of her life that seemed to mirror Isabel's in unsettling ways. He couldn't just let it go. Not this time. Not when he felt like he was so close to the truth. Victor had spent years trying to bury his past, to move on from the heartbreak of losing Isabel. He had thrown himself into his work, into his wealth, building an empire that had distracted him from the pain. But now, this young waitress had pulled him back into a chapter of his life he had thought was closed forever, and he couldn't rest until he understood why. The next morning, Victor hired a private investigator. He had used their services in the past for business matters, but this was different. This was personal. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire, listened carefully as Victor explained his suspicions about Clara. She didn't ask questions, didn't challenge his conclusions. She simply nodded and promised to get to work. Victor spent the next few days trying to focus on his business, but it was impossible. Every time he sat down at his desk, Clara's face appeared in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of her standing before him, her eyes so much like Isabel's that it was almost painful to look at. It was as if his mind had been fixated on the idea of finding Isabel again. Only this time, she wasn't the woman he had known. She was someone new, someone he didn't understand. The investigator's findings came quicker than he had expected. Claire called him one afternoon, her voice calm but urgent. "Victor," she began, "I've got some information on Clara. It's unsettling." Victor's heart skipped a beat. He listened intently as Claire continued, detailing Clara's life history, her adoption records, or rather, the lack of them. The most shocking discovery, however, was the timing. Clara had been adopted just a few months after Isabel's tragic death. That fact, more than anything, sent a shiver down Victor's spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. The timing was too precise, too deliberate. It felt like the universe was pulling him towards something he wasn't ready to face. "I need to meet Clara," Victor said, his voice tight with emotion. "I need to know the truth." Victor's obsession with Clara had grown over the days that followed. He could no longer ignore the pull he felt toward her, the way his thoughts seemed to be drawn to her without his control. Every time he entered the restaurant, he searched for her, watching her every movement with the kind of intensity that made him feel both alive and uneasy. She was always busy, always moving with purpose, but there was something in the way she looked at him when their paths crossed, a brief, almost imperceptible recognition that neither of them had spoken of. It was as if Clara, too, sensed the connection that had yet to be fully understood. Victor had to know. He could no longer wait for the investigation to unfold. He had to confront Clara himself, to see if the truth was hidden in her eyes the way it had once been in Isabel's. One afternoon, Victor arrived at the restaurant early, hoping to catch Clara when she wasn't busy. He sat at a corner table, his gaze fixed on the door, his thoughts churning. A few minutes later, Clara walked in, a tray of drinks in hand. She paused for a moment when she saw him, but then her face softened, and she approached him with the same calm professionalism she always displayed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reynolds," she greeted him, her voice light but distant. She placed a menu on the table in front of him, and for a moment there was a silence between them. Victor could feel the weight of his unspoken words hanging in the air, but he didn't know how to begin. How could he explain to her that he believed she was connected to Isabel, the woman he had lost? That the very thing he had been running from for years had found its way back into his life through her? Finally, Victor spoke, his voice unsteady. "Clara, I I need to talk to you. Please, sit down." Clara hesitated, looking around the restaurant to make sure there was no rush of customers needing her attention. When she saw there was no immediate demand for her, she nodded and took a seat across from him. Victor looked at her closely, his eyes searching for any sign of recognition in her face. "I know this is going to sound strange," he began, "but I believe there's something about you that I need to understand, something that connects you to my past, to Isabel." Clara's eyes widened in confusion, and Victor saw a flicker of discomfort cross her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know you. I don't know anything about Isabel." Victor felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't expected her to respond like this, hadn't anticipated the shock that would radiate from her, but he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to the truth. "I'm not sure how to explain this, but you look exactly like her, like Isabel, my ex-wife. And the more I've learned about you, the more I believe that there's something connecting us, something I don't understand." Clara's face softened, but there was an unmistakable edge of defensiveness in her voice as she replied, "I'm not Isabel. I don't know who she is, and I don't know what this is about, but I don't want to get involved in your past." Victor's heart sank. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but the rejection stung more than he had expected. Still, he pressed on. "I know this is hard to understand, but I need you to help me find the truth. You were adopted, Clara, and Isabel died shortly before your adoption was finalized. There's something more here, something that I need to know." Clara stood up abruptly, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "I don't need you to solve my life's mysteries," she snapped, her voice shaking. "I don't know why you're doing this, but I'm not interested." She turned and walked away, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts. Victor watched Clara walk away, her retreating figure filling him with a sense of helplessness. Her rejection stung more than he had expected, especially after everything he had learned, everything he had hoped for. He had believed that by confronting her, he would finally uncover the truth about the mysterious connection between Clara and Isabel. But now, as he sat alone at the table, the weight of his failure pressed heavily on his chest. Sophie's words echoed in his mind. "I don't need you to solve my life's mysteries." She had rejected him, rejected his intrusion into her life. And yet, despite the hurt, there was a part of him that couldn't let go. The resemblance, the timing of her adoption, it all pointed to something far deeper than coincidence. But he couldn't force her to understand. He couldn't make her believe that the strange pull he felt wasn't some misguided obsession, but the search for something he thought he had lost forever. The guilt weighed on him and the doubts crept in. Had he crossed a line? Was he imposing on Clara's life in a way that was neither fair nor right? He had been so consumed by his quest for answers that he had failed to see how much his actions might hurt her. He had assumed she would want to know the truth. But perhaps she didn't. Perhaps the answers he sought were not hers to give. In the days that followed, Victor found himself in a state of internal conflict. The more he reflected on his conversation with Clara, the more he realized that his obsession had clouded his judgment. He had pushed too hard, too fast. But the truth was, he couldn't just walk away. There was something about Clara that kept drawing him back, something intangible, something that felt like unfinished business. Victor couldn't stop thinking about her. He found himself returning to the restaurant, not to confront her again, but simply to watch, to observe, to search for the missing pieces of the puzzle that he had been unable to see before. But each time Clara looked at him, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, uncertainty, distrust, perhaps even fear. The connection he had felt the first time they met now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a wall of silence between them. Weeks passed in a blur for Victor. His life had become a cycle of restless nights and distracted days, his mind perpetually fixed on the unanswered questions about Clara and Isabel. The guilt from his failed confrontation continued, and he found himself questioning his every decision. Had he been too impulsive, too reckless in his pursuit of the truth? He had tried to focus on his work, but it was no use. The weight of his obsession overshadowed everything else. His thoughts kept circling back to Clara. He had learned more about her through the investigation, but every new piece of information only raised more questions. The timing of her adoption, the lack of any trace of her biological family, it all pointed to a connection with Isabel, one that Victor couldn't ignore. And yet, Clara seemed to want nothing to do with him. She had made it clear that she didn't want his help, that she didn't want to be involved in the mystery that surrounded her. But despite her rejection, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that she was the key to unlocking the answers he had been searching for. In an attempt to find some peace, Victor took a short trip to his family's estate, hoping the quiet surroundings would help him clear his mind. But even there, surrounded by the serene beauty of nature, he couldn't escape the thoughts of Clara. He found himself replaying their last conversation over and over in his head, wondering if he could have approached her differently. If he had been more patient, more understanding, would she have opened up to him? The guilt continued to weigh on him. He knew he couldn't keep chasing after the past, after a version of Isabel that was forever gone. But he also couldn't deny that there was something in Clara, something that reminded him of the life he had once shared with Isabel, the life that had been ripped away so suddenly. Victor realized that his quest for answers wasn't just about finding the truth about Clara or Isabel. It was about something deeper, something more personal. It was about finding peace. He had spent so many years trying to outrun his grief, trying to bury the pain of Isabel's loss, but it was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. He had thought that solving the mystery of Clara would bring him closure, but now he understood that the answers he sought might never come. The only way forward was to accept the unknown, to find a way to let go of the past and make peace with it. The day after returning from his trip, Victor walked into the restaurant one last time, determined to make things right with Clara. He had no grand expectations. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but he knew he couldn't keep running in circles. He had to face her, apologize for his intrusion, and let her know that he was no longer searching for answers. He had come to terms with the fact that some things were simply beyond his control. Clara was busy, but when she saw him standing at the bar, she walked over, her face unreadable. Victor stood tall, his posture apologetic. "Clara," he said softly, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him, her expression cautious. "What for?" she asked, her voice cool. "For pushing you, for asking questions you didn't want to answer. I was wrong to involve you in my search for answers. You didn't deserve that." Clara studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know what you were hoping for," she said, her voice quieter now, "but I don't have the answers you're looking for. I don't know anything about Isabel." Victor nodded, his heart heavy. "I understand, and I've come to realize that I've been holding on to something for too long. I thought that if I found the connection, it would bring me peace. But now I know that I have to find peace within myself." Clara's gaze softened slightly, and for the first time, she seemed to relax, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I hope you find it," she said quietly. Victor nodded, grateful for her words. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was a step toward healing, a step toward letting go of the past. And as he turned to leave, he realized that perhaps, in the end, it wasn't about solving the mystery of Clara. It was about learning to move forward, to live in the present and accept that some questions would never be answered. In the days that followed his meeting with Clara, Victor found himself grappling with a new realization. He had assumed that finding a connection between Clara and Isabel would be the key to unlocking his past, but now he wasn't so sure. Despite the fact that Clara had rejected him, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her story, something that tied her to Isabel in a way that no one had anticipated. Victor's private investigator had continued to dig into Clara's background, and the results were unsettling, to say the least. Sophie, as she had been named at birth, had been adopted just months after Isabel's untimely death. There was no sign of any biological relatives, no trace of a family to claim her. The fact that Sophie had been placed with a family shortly after Isabel's passing was a coincidence that seemed too much to ignore. The unsettling discovery only deepened Victor's sense that something more was at play. The investigation also uncovered that Sophie's adoption had been somewhat unusual. The records were vague, and certain details seemed to have been intentionally left out. There were whispers that Sophie's adoption had been arranged privately, with little oversight from the authorities. But what did that mean? Was it possible that Sophie had been hidden away for some reason? And if so, why? Victor knew he couldn't continue down this path without confronting the issue head-on. He had to speak with Clara again, even though he was unsure of what kind of response he might receive. It was a delicate balance. He didn't want to push her further away, but at the same time, he had to know the truth. One evening, he returned to the restaurant, his nerves on edge. Clara was behind the bar, as usual, her focus on the patrons, but her eyes flicked to him as soon as he entered. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. Victor took a deep breath, walking up to the bar and leaning on it lightly. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Clara didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her eyes unreadable. After a long pause, she nodded slightly. "I thought we already talked," she replied, her tone cool but not dismissive. "I've learned some things," Victor began, trying to steady himself. "Things I think you need to know. Things about your adoption, about Isabel." Clara's face tightened at the mention of Isabel's name. "I don't want to talk about her," she said, her voice low. Victor took a step closer, his voice softer now. "I don't want to talk about Isabel either, not in the way you think. But, Clara, there's something about you, something about your story that I can't ignore. I can't stop thinking about it." Clara took a step back, her face now guarded. "I don't want your help," she said firmly. "I don't need you digging into my past. It's mine, and it's not something I'm willing to share with anyone, least of all, you." Victor paused, struggling to find the right words. "I understand, but I think we both know there's more to this, more to you, more to your past. You don't have to tell me everything, but I can't let go of this feeling. I need to know why there's such an uncanny resemblance between you and Isabel, why your adoption happened the way it did." Clara's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You think I'm some kind of replacement for her? That I'm just some kind of puzzle you can solve?" Victor's heart sank. He had clearly overstepped, pushing Clara to a point where her anger was palpable. "No, that's not it at all. I'm not trying to replace Isabel. I'm trying to understand, Clara. I'm trying to understand why you feel so familiar." Clara stared at him for a long moment, the silence between them heavy. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have answers for you. I don't know why I feel like this either." Victor's frustration mounted, but he also understood. Clara was trying to protect herself. She had built walls around her past, walls that he had only just begun to understand. But that didn't stop the need for answers. It didn't stop the sense of connection that he felt. Victor knew he couldn't continue pushing Clara like this. The truth, if it was to be uncovered, had to come from her. But as much as he wanted answers, he also knew that the only way forward was to give her space. He had to allow her to make the next move. He would wait, patient but resolute. The mystery of Clara and Isabel was not something that could be forced open. It would take time for Clara to trust him enough to reveal what she knew, if anything. A week passed before he saw Clara again. She was sitting at a table, reading through some paperwork, her brow furrowed in concentration. Victor hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. But before he could make a decision, Clara looked up and saw him standing at the entrance. Her expression softened ever so slightly, and she nodded for him to join her. Victor walked over to the table, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a seat across from her, but neither spoke at first. There was an air of tension between them, but It was different this time. It wasn't anger or rejection. It was something more akin to quiet understanding, a recognition that both of them had been carrying burdens that were not easily shared. I've thought about what you said. Clara finally spoke, her voice calm but laced with uncertainty. About the way I've been shutting you out, and I guess maybe I've been wrong. Victor looked at her, surprised by the shift in her tone. You don't have to explain anything to me, Clara, he said gently. I've pushed too hard. I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. Clara took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting with the papers in front of her. It's not that, she said. It's just, there's so much I don't know, and even more that I'm afraid to know. Victor leaned in, his eyes filled with empathy. You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to. But if there's anything you want to share, I'm here. Clara hesitated for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the side. I don't know why, but I feel like I should tell you something. Maybe it will make sense of everything. Maybe it won't. But here goes. Victor listened closely, his heart racing as Clara began to speak. She wasn't looking at him now, but the words she said next would change everything. Clara's voice was soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself rather than to Victor. She paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts before continuing. When I was adopted, I was told little about my real parents. I don't know who they were, but I've always felt different. Like I didn't quite belong with the family that took me in, no matter how much they loved me. Victor leaned forward, his heart racing with anticipation, knowing this was the moment where everything might start to fall into place. Do you remember anything about them? Anything at all that might link you to Isabel? He asked, his voice quiet but urgent. Clara shook her head slowly, her eyes distant as if she were trying to piece together fragments of memories that had long been buried. I only know what I've been told, that I was a baby when they adopted me, that my biological parents died, but there's something in the back of my mind that always nagged at me, something I couldn't quite remember. She paused, looking up at Victor. But there's one thing I do know. My birth mother's name was Isabel. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Victor's breath caught in his throat, and the world around him seemed to fall away. Isabel, his late wife, the woman he had loved and lost. He had never once considered the possibility that Clara, the young woman before him, could be connected to Isabel in such a profound way. The truth was too staggering to comprehend, yet it was all but impossible to deny. Isabel was your mother? Victor asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clara nodded, her gaze now locked on his. I've never been sure how, but everything I've learned about Isabel, about her life, the time she spent before she died, it's all starting to make sense. You're the man she was married to, aren't you? Victor didn't answer right away. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. The pain of Isabel's death, which he had tried so hard to bury for so long, began to resurface. But this time, it wasn't just pain. It was something else, something more complicated, filled with questions and unresolved emotions. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Yes, I was married to Isabel, but she died a few months after you were born, Clara. I had no idea you were even alive. Clara's eyes filled with sadness. I know. I didn't know anything about you either, but I always wondered why I never fit in, why I felt this strange pull, like there was something I needed to find, something missing. And now it's you. You were part of her life, part of my life, in some way I can't yet fully understand. Victor's heart broke at the sight of Clara, who seemed so vulnerable in that moment. She had spent her entire life in the dark about her past, and now, faced with the shocking truth of her connection to Isabel, she was just as lost as he was. There were still so many questions. Questions about Isabel's death, about Clara's adoption, and most importantly, about the strange fate that brought them together after all these years. Clara's voice was barely audible as she spoke again, almost as if she were trying to make sense of it all. I never had a chance to know her, to understand her. And now, it's like I'm meeting a ghost, a part of her I never knew existed. But I need to know, Victor, why was I kept from you? Why didn't anyone tell you about me? Victor looked away for a moment, his mind racing. The answers were elusive, shrouded in secrecy. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He had to help Clara find peace, just as he had once tried to do for Isabel. I don't have all the answers, Clara. he said, his voice filled with regret. But I promise you this, I will help you find them. I will help you understand who you are and why things happened the way they did. Clara looked at him, her expression filled with a mix of fear and hope. And what about us, Victor? What does all of this mean for us? Victor took her hand in his, offering her a small but sincere smile. I don't know what it means yet, Clara, but I know that we're connected. And that connection, it matters. We'll figure it out together. The days following their conversation were filled with tension and uncertainty. Victor couldn't stop thinking about Clara. The discovery that she was Isabel's daughter was overwhelming, but there was something else that kept him up at night, a desire to make things right. For too long, he had been consumed by his grief, his longing for Isabel, and now he had a chance to do right by Clara, to help her where he had failed Isabel. Clara, on the other hand, had retreated into herself. The truth about her origins had shaken her to her core, and she didn't know how to process it. She had always known there was something missing in her life, but now she had found the missing piece, and it brought with it a flood of emotions she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Victor knew he had to do something to help. He couldn't change the past, but he could offer Clara something in the present, a gesture of kindness that might help her feel less alone in this strange new world she had just discovered. One afternoon, as Clara was leaving work, she was handed an envelope. It was an unmarked envelope with no return address and no clue as to who might have sent it. Inside, she found a check, one that was more than enough to cover her tuition for the rest of her education, her rent, and several months of expenses. Confused and overwhelmed, Clara held the check in her hands, staring at it in disbelief. She knew it had to be from someone who cared, someone who wanted to help. But who? She had no idea, and the mystery of it only deepened the sense of unease she had been feeling. When she finally confronted Victor, her emotions were raw. She had to know who was behind the gesture. "Victor, why did you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and confusion. Victor met her gaze, his eyes filled with compassion. "I know things are difficult right now, Clara, and I know you're dealing with more than anyone should have to. But I want to help you, not because of Isabel, but because you deserve it. You deserve a chance to live the life you've always wanted, free from the burdens of your past." Clara didn't know what to say. She had always prided herself on being independent, on not needing anyone's help. But in that moment, she realized that she wasn't alone anymore. Victor had shown her a kindness she never expected, and it touched her in ways she couldn't explain. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But thank you. Thank you for giving me this chance." Victor reached out and took her hand gently. "You don't have to thank me, Clara. You've already given me more than I ever thought possible." In that moment, both of them understood that the journey ahead would be difficult, but it was a journey they would take together. And maybe, just maybe, they would find the peace they had both been searching for all along. The days that followed the unexpected financial gesture were filled with new revelations and tentative steps toward healing. Clara, who had always relied on her own strength, found herself grappling with emotions she hadn't anticipated. The truth about her origins, her connection to Isabel, and Victor's kindness had left her feeling both grateful and vulnerable. Victor, on the other hand, was beginning to understand the weight of the journey he had set out on with Clara. The grief he had carried for so long, the sorrow of losing Isabel, had been replaced with a sense of purpose. He no longer viewed Clara merely as a link to his late wife. She had become a person in her own right, someone he was genuinely invested in, someone he wanted to help heal. The two met again one evening at the quiet cafe where they had first shared their conversation about Isabel. This time, there was no rush, no pressure. The awkwardness between them had softened, replaced with a new understanding. Clara sat down across from Victor, the warm evening light casting gentle shadows on their faces. "Victor," she began, her voice steadier than before, "I've been thinking about everything you've done for me, the tuition, your support. I don't even know how to express my gratitude." Victor smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "You don't have to thank me, Clara. You're not a project for me to fix. What I've done, it's because I see you. Not as Isabel's daughter, but as you, Clara. And I want to see you succeed, not out of obligation, but because I believe you deserve it." Clara swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She had never known such kindness, never experienced the kind of support that wasn't laced with expectation or pity. Victor's words meant more to her than she could express, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she had someone on her side. "I don't know if I can ever fully understand everything, Victor," she said quietly. "The connection to Isabel, my adoption, my past, it feels like too much, like I'm standing at the edge of something huge, something that will change everything. But I'm trying. I'm trying to make peace with it all." Victor leaned forward, his voice soft but steady. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Clara. You're allowed to take your time, to figure it out at your own pace. But know this, whatever you decide, wherever this journey takes us, I'll be here for you." Clara's heart swelled, a mixture of emotions rising within her. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could face it. She could take the next step, even if she didn't have it all figured out. "I'm not asking for anything, Clara," Victor continued. "But I would like to be a part of your future, not as someone who is tied to the past, but as someone who believes in the person you are and the person you'll become." Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. I think I'd like that too." The charity gala was a grand affair, a testament to the years of hard work and philanthropy that Victor had built. It was an event filled with well-dressed guests, speeches, and donations, all aimed at supporting causes close to his heart. But for Victor, this night held more significance than any of the previous galas. It was the culmination of his own personal journey, a journey that had taken him through grief, guilt, and finally, healing. Clara stood by his side, a confident and poised young woman who had found a path of her own. Though the journey had been complicated, she was now stronger and more at peace with herself than she had ever been. The shadows of her past, while never completely gone, no longer defined her. She had carved out a future for herself, one that wasn't overshadowed by the mysteries of her origins. As Victor stood before the crowd, giving a speech about the importance of supporting young women in their pursuit of education and empowerment, Clara watched him from the sidelines. She could see the weight had lifted from his shoulders. His grief over Isabel had not disappeared, but it was no longer all consuming. He had found a new purpose, not in finding answers to his past, but in helping others move forward. Victor's voice rang out with conviction, a strength that had been born from his own journey of loss and redemption. "Tonight, we celebrate the power of second chances," he said, his gaze shifting toward Clara, who stood with quiet grace in the background. "The opportunity to make a difference in someone's life, to give them the support they need to rise above their challenges. We all have a part to play in helping each other find our way." Clara felt a sense of peace wash over her as she listened to him speak. There was no more confusion, no more unresolved questions. She understood now that closure didn't mean having all the answers. It meant accepting the unknown and embracing the journey forward. It meant finding strength in the relationships she had built and the opportunities she had been given. As the night wore on, Clara and Victor shared a quiet moment outside the gala. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the warmth of the event, and for a moment they simply stood together side by side. "Do you feel it too?" Clara asked, her voice soft. Victor nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I do. It's not the ending I expected, but it's the one I needed, for both of us." Clara smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "I think we both have a lot to look forward to." Victor reached out, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. "The future is ours to shape, Clara. And no matter what comes next, we'll face it together." As the night faded into the early hours of the morning, both Victor and Clara realized that they had found something precious. Peace, understanding, and the promise of a future built on compassion, not just for each other, but for the world around them. In that moment, they both knew that healing had already begun. And with it, they had discovered the power of letting go and moving forward, no matter the uncertainty. As the last notes of the gala echoed into the night, Victor and Clara stood at the threshold of a new chapter in their lives. The past, with its pain and unanswered questions, no longer held them captive. Instead, they had found strength in each other, in the quiet understanding that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from solving every mystery, but from embracing the journey itself. Victor had learned that closure wasn't about finding all the answers. It was about accepting the unknown, letting go of the past, and creating a future built on compassion, hope, and new beginnings. Clara, too, had discovered that her true identity was not defined by the shadows of her past, but by the person she was becoming, a woman with a future all her own. Together, they had come to realize that healing wasn't a destination, but a process. And in that process, they had found peace, not in perfection, but in the quiet courage to move forward, hand in hand, ready to face whatever life had in store for them. And so, as the night drew to a close and the city lights flickered around them, Victor and Clara walked forward, not as two people bound by grief, but as individuals who had found their way back to hope. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey and for staying with the story until the very end. Your time and attention mean the world to us, and we hope you found something meaningful in the tale of healing, growth, and new beginnings. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating content. Your support helps us create even more engaging stories and videos. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, so feel free to share your feedback. Thank you again, and we can't wait to bring you more amazing stories. Until next time.